This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nietzahone, and today is Monday, and that means it's time for the 497th edition of MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. The 500th episode of this series is quickly approaching, and it's going to be an extra long special episode. If you want to make sure you stay aware of that video and others, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. As you probably know by now, Dominaria United's release is just around the corner, and one really cool thing about that set is that collector boosters will have a small chance of containing a card from the original Legends, a set that came out way back in 1994. I thought that meant it was a good time to do an MTG Top 10 on Legends. So, Legends is often remembered for having a lot of bad cards in it, including 3 absolutely terrible cycles: the Glyphs, the multicolored vanilla Legends, and a cycle of lands that gives your Legends bands with other Legends, among other things. There are also some individual worst ever cards in the set, like Wood Elemental and Mold Demon. Basically, if you watch any of my MTG Top 10s on bad cards, you've seen a lot of cards from this set. This preponderance of awful cards has led to some thinking of Legends as a bad set overall, but despite all those terrible cards, Legends also has a whole bunch of really important cards too. It shows up sometimes on lists about the worst Magic sets ever, and it really shouldn't, as we'll see in this list. It's also one of the most historically significant sets of all time, because it introduced both legendary permanents and multicolor cards. To be eligible for this list, a card had to receive its original printing in Legends. This means no reprints in the set were eligible. In all, there were 310 cards that were eligible for this list, and in this video we'll take a look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours and World Championships, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like Grand Prix and Magic Fests. Alright, let's get to our list. At number 10, it's Land Tax. This enchantment only costs 1 mana, and that's pretty amazing because it can repeatedly draw you 3 cards at a time without any additional investment. Basically, this is White's Ancestral Recall. Okay, I'm obviously joking a little bit since you only get to draw those cards if your opponent has more lands than you, and the cards you draw all have to be basic lands, but I'm making the comparison for a reason. This is 1 mana and it generates a ton of card advantage, even if what you're drawing is lands. It was a staple in White decks during Magic's early days. This is because it paired pretty impressively with a number of different cards in the standard of the time. First, you could utilize it alongside Ivory Tower and or Zuron Orb to gain a ton of life, making it pretty impossible for any aggro deck to ever take you down. Second, you could load up your hand with lands ahead of casting your Armageddon, and of course you wouldn't have any problem rebuilding your board afterwards because you have those lands. Lots of those decks also ran Winter Orb, and you could use your land tax trigger to make sure you would always have an untapped land to play during your turn. Later in its history, it got banned in both Extended and Legacy, though it is legal in Legacy today. Its success was ultimately short-lived, but Land Tax was an incredibly important card in 1995 and 1996. At number 9, it's Boomerang. For 2 blue mana, this instant lets you bounce any permanent to its owner's hand, which is a nice deal. While it was printed for the first time in Legends, it has been reprinted a lot, including in Mirage and 5th through 9th edition, which has led to it having a lot of time as a standard and extended legal card between the mid-1990s and the mid-2000s. In Standard, it first found success in Magic's first ever prison deck, which was built around Stasis. It could give you the ability to slow down your opponent ahead of shutting down the game with the prison enchantment, and you could also use it later in the game to bounce your own Stasis so you could untap as normal. In a later Standard format, it was also part of one of the coolest tournament decks ever, Owling Mine, which sought to make the opponent have a ton of cards in hand so that Ebony Owl Netsuke would wreck them, and Boomerang had the double effect of allowing you to bounce a card back to their hand, and if you happened to bounce a land, it also meant that your opponent would have a hard time casting their spells. It also saw significant play in extended blue-black control decks. It hasn't gained any points, though, since 2005. At number 8, it is Force Spike. This is a 1-mana counterspell that can counter a spell of any type, which is pretty awesome. The downside, of course, is that your opponent can ignore it if they pay 1 generic mana. However, in the early game, players tend to tap out to add to the board, and Force Spike can really punish that. It didn't actually find any success in any format as a result of its original printing, but later reprints led to it being played in decks like Psychotog Control in Standard, and in a variety of blue control and combo decks in Extended. It's another Legends card whose best days are probably behind it, though. At number 7, it is the Tabernacle at Pendrell Vale. Tabernacle, like a lot of non-basic lands at the time, couldn't actually produce mana, which is a pretty big problem, but luckily this has a powerful effect. It harshly punishes players who are playing a bunch of creatures by taxing them 1 mana every turn to keep each of their creatures around. The Tabernacle is only seen play in the Eternal formats, and of course solely in decks that run no creatures, or very few of them, so they don't get punished by the effect of their own land. It's been played the most in Legacy lands, a deck loaded up with a bunch of utility lands and ways to tutor them up. Most versions of the deck run a singleton copy of the Tabernacle to tutor up against opponents whose board presence is getting a little too scary. It also sees play in the sideboard of Vintage Mud decks. That's an artifact-centric deck that plays several prison effects that make it hard for the opponent to have the mana to pay for these creatures every turn. Tabernacle has really been enjoying success lately, largely as a result of Legacy lands, and it's likely to continue to gain points. At number 6, it is Mana Drain. This costs the same amount of mana as Counterspell, and it is actually strictly better than Counterspell since it gives you colorless mana on your next upkeep equal to the mana value of the spell you counter. Now, back when Legends was printed, that wasn't always upside because mana burn was a thing. If you had excess mana in your mana pool at the end of a phase, you actually took damage equal to the amount of mana you had left over. So sometimes Mana Drain would hurt you if you didn't have anything to do with the mana, but even in the days of Mana Burn, Mana Drain still typically only provided some serious upside thanks to that extra mana. There's a pretty good argument that Mana Drain is the second best counterspell of all time, behind only Force of Will. Despite all this power, it only achieved a single top 8 between Standard and Extended. Instead, it's done the most work in control decks in Legacy and Vintage. Ultimately, it was deemed too good for Legacy and was banned in the format in 2004, and it remains banned today. So, Vintage is the only format where you can play Mana Drain, and it is still putting up points there today. At number 5, it is Divine Offering. This is great at destroying artifacts, as you can take one down for 2 mana and gain some life at the same time. Obviously, it's largely been a sideboard card, as most formats don't have so many main deck artifacts that you want to put this in your deck. It saw sideboard play back in the Standard of 1996, which was a format with a lot of powerful artifacts, like the aforementioned Ivory Tower and Zuron Orb. It gained the rest of its points as a result of a reprint in Mirrodin Besieged. That standard was also loaded up with artifacts, so Divine Offering even saw a little bit of main deck play. It doesn't have any points since the second time it rotated out of Standard, and it isn't likely that it's going to gain any more points in the future unless it gets another Standard legal reprint, and in the long run, Mana Drain will outpace it. At number 4, it is Pendlehaven. In most ways, this is a forest with upside. It comes into play untapped and can immediately tap for green mana, but it also can tap to give +1/+2 to a 1/1 creature. Pretty much every green deck has 1/1s. I mean, mana dorks are a thing. It does come with the downside of being legendary, which means you can't have more than one of them in play, and running more than just one in your deck can be a liability, but that first copy is pretty amazing. Pendlehaven's status as basically just a better forest has led to it accumulating lots of points over the years in multiple formats. It did not gain any points as a result of its original printing, though. Instead, it took a reprint in Time Spiral in 2006 for Pendlehaven to really start to accumulate points. In most formats, it's played in basically any green deck that has 1/1s in it, so instead of going through an exhaustive list of those decks, I'm going to hit a couple of the highlights where Pendlehaven was just a little better than it would be in other decks. One example of this was Doron decks in Standard and Extended, which paid you off for creatures having higher toughness than power, and Pendlehaven makes a 1/1 into a 2/3, and that 2/3 will hit for 3 if Doron's in play, and that's pretty cool. It has the distinction distinction of being the only card on the list with points in Modern, a format it's legal in thanks to that time-shifted reprint. And in Modern, Infect decks often seek to do a ton of damage with creatures that start small, and Pendlehaven can really help you do that. Pendlehaven is going to continue to amass points as we move forward. At number 3, it is Sylvan Library. The original text box on this card is kind of a mess, so instead of showing you the original printing of this card like I normally would, I'm going to start by showing you a more recent reprint that's templated way better. Basically, this 2-mana enchantment gives you the option of drawing 2 extra cards every upkeep, then you choose 2 cards in your hand that you drew on the turn, and you can put them back on top of your library. You can also pay 4 life for each of those cards to just keep them in your hand. So at worst, this gives you some nice card selection, and at best, it allows you to draw a ton of cards at the cost of life. It saw some significant play in both Standard and Extended, but the Eternal formats, and especially Legacy, are where it has done the most work. It sees play in a variety of green decks in Legacy, including Show and Tell, Canadian Threshold, and Bant Control, and in Vintage it's most commonly played in Bug midrange. It's going to keep gaining points going forward. At number 2, it is Chain Lightning. While it is often overshadowed by its big brother, Lightning Bolt, Chain Lightning is a powerful card in its own right. It's not an instant, but 1 mana for 3 damage to any target is quite impressive, even on a sorcery. It also has the additional interesting effect that your opponent can pay mana to cast their own Chain Lightning, but if they do that, you'll get another chance too. Chain Lightning was played at Magic's very first competitive event, the 1994 World Championship, where it appeared in 2 different decks that finished in the top 8. It's also found significant success in Legacy, where it's been played in aggro and tempo decks like Burn, Zoo, Canadian Threshold, and Delver. It's also greatly benefited from Pauper becoming an officially sanctioned format because it's an incredibly powerful common. It's going to keep gaining points in the future, but it seems unlikely it will ever catch the number 1 card on the list, which is Karakos. Karakos, like Pendlehaven, is a legendary land that comes into play untapped and can produce colored mana right away, and it also comes with a powerful activated ability. So powerful, in fact, that it's a staple in Legacy, and it sees a fair bit of play in Vintage, too. One of the big uses for the card in those formats is to bounce legendary creatures that other players like to cheat into play, like Emrakul or Iona. Decks that do that type of thing are a pretty big part of the Legacy metagame. It's pretty difficult to counter this effect too. Karakos is a really annoying obstacle that those decks have to find a way to deal with or they just can't win. You can also use it on your own legendary creatures to reuse into the battlefield abilities or save them from removal. It appears in just about every white Legacy deck and it's going to keep gaining points going forward, which means it's going to hold on to its number 1 slot on this list. So, those are the 10 cards from Legends that have been the most successful at Magic's highest level of competition. Unsurprisingly, this list is completely devoid of creatures, which were all pretty bad back then. If you want to own any of these powerful Legends cards, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each of them. If you want to make sure you catch future episodes of the series, including the special 500th episode, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on the past episodes of this series, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.